The relationship between ego versus task-oriented motivation and Wonderlic test scores, average college GPA, and ACT scores as self-reported by college students by Bailey Taggart. For my final project, I decided to attempt to find a relationship between whether someone is ego or task-oriented in their motivation style and their level of intelligence. I used the variables of Wonderlic test scores, average college GPA, and ACT scores to reflect the level of intelligence of each student. My sample was 21 students attending Utah State University and taking the same measurement and evaluation course from the kinesiology department, of whom not every student answered every measure. So, what is ego and task orientation when it comes to motivation styles? Ego orientation is when someone is motivated by proving they can do something or that they are not unable to do something. They are especially motivated when they can do things that others cannot. Task orientation is when someone is motivated by making achievements and completing tasks, regardless of whether they are the best or the only one who can complete the task. They want to make that achievement. According to current research, ego-oriented people tend to focus on surface-level learning just enough to make others believe that they are competent in the material, while task-oriented people seek mastery of the material, gaining an in-depth understanding of the material itself. Ego-oriented people are also more likely to think that their level of intelligence is fixed. If they are highly intelligent, they will continue to be so, and vice versa. Task-oriented people tend to believe that they can change and adapt their level of intelligence, which also means they believe that they can improve their level of intelligence. Also, while both ego and task-oriented people excel in performance-based goals, generally more task-oriented people excel in mastery-based goals, which require them to dedicate more time and energy to gaining a full in-depth understanding of the materials. My primary research question was whether more intelligent people, according to Wonderlic test scores, average college GPA, and ACT scores, were more likely to have an ego-oriented motivation style, or a task-oriented motivation style. I hypothesized that higher scores on the Wonderlic test, a higher college GPA, and higher ACT scores in college students would be positively related to higher scores in ego-oriented motivation, and negatively related with higher scores in task-oriented motivation. The dependent variables were the ego and task orientation scores, which were the self-reported scores of a motivation assessment quiz. This quiz was provided to the students and it asked them to rate the amount of success they feel in differing situations in a sport. Depending on their answers to different questions, they received a score of 1 to 5 for each of the motivation orientation scores, with 1 being a low orientation and 5 being a high orientation. The independent variables were Wonderlic test scores, average college GPA, and ACT scores. All of the results were self-reported. The Wonderlic test scores were obtained by having the students take a mock version of the Wonderlic test and receive their score, which could range from 1 to 50, 1 being the lowest and 50 being a perfect score, then reporting the value they received. The average college GPA values were the values reported by the students as their current average GPA according to Utah State University. GPAs can range from 0.0 to 4.0. Finally, the ACT scores were the highest ACT score each student managed during high school. In accordance with ACT testing standards, the scores could range from 1 to 36. Here I have displayed the descriptive statistics of each variable. As this table shows, 2 students failed to provide their ego and task orientation scores, and 1 student did not provide an ACT score. It appears the average task orientation score was about 4, with a range of 3.3 to 5, and a standard deviation of about 0.5, while ego orientation scores had a mean of about 3.5, a range of 1.5 to 5, and a standard deviation of about 0.9, showing that our sample seems to be slightly more task-oriented. The Wonderlic scores had an average of about 22.5, but with a relatively large standard deviation of about 6, and the range of test scores was 10 to 36. The average GPA was about 3.5, with a standard deviation of about 0.3, ranging from 3 to 4. The average ACT score was 24.25, with the standard deviation of 4.35 and a range from 19 to 33. Next, I have displayed the distribution of each variable. It appears the Wonderlic test scores and ACT scores are about normally distributed, meaning the most values are around the average. The ego and task orientation scores are slightly negatively skewed, meaning the values were focused more to the right of the graph in the higher values. Finally, GPA was positively skewed, meaning the values were focused more to the left side of the graph in the lower values. My next step was to run the correlations of each of the independent variables with each of the dependent variables. First, I have the results of the ego scores and the independent variables. In this first graph, the correlation of ego scores and ACT scores is shown. Here we can see that there is a moderate positive correlation. However, the p-value shows this to be statistically insignificant. The second graph shows the correlation of ego scores and Wonderlic scores, which has a slight positive correlation, but again, with no statistical significance according to the p-value. And finally, the graph of the correlation of ego scores and average college GPA is shown. In the final graph, showing a slight positive correlation, but again, with no statistical significance according to its p-value. Next, I have displayed the results of the correlations between the task scores and the independent variables. In this first graph, the correlation of task scores and ACT scores shows there's mostly no correlation, and no statistical significance either according to the p-value. In the second graph, the correlation of task scores and Wonderlic scores is shown to have a moderate negative correlation and no statistical significance again according to the p-value. Finally, the correlation of the task scores and average college GPA shows no correlation and no statistical significance, again according to the p-value, meaning of all the correlations I ran, none of them showed any statistical significance. I also ran 2 linear regressions, not because they would show anything new, but mainly to reinforce the lack of relationship in my variables. In the ego scores linear regression, the r-squared value was 0.203, which would show the independent variables would account for about 20.3% of the variance in the ego scores. However, this was not true because the model was not significant, which was expected from the results of the correlations. In the task scores linear regression, the r-squared value was 0.344, which would show the independent variables would account for about 34.4% of the variance in the task scores. However, again, this model was not significant, which was also expected according to the correlations run previously, and showed there was no relationship between my variables here either. I did not find any significant relationships in the intelligence of these students and their ego and task orientation scores. All of the tests I ran showed statistical insignificance. Therefore, I failed to reject the null hypothesis of either of my hypotheses, meaning I cannot conclude that there is a correlation between these variables at all. This does not agree with the research that has been done before on this subject, which leads me to believe that the limitations of this study may have skewed the results. The results may have been impacted by the limitations of this research study. First and foremost, this sample was extremely limited in both size and diversity. With only 21 students participating in the research, it would be hard to find any statistical significance in a relationship within this data. There's just not enough data points. On top of that, these 21 students were all taken from the same measurement and evaluation course in the kinesiology department at Utah State University, meaning these students likely came from similar backgrounds and had similar ages. On top of that, there was missing data points to limit the data set even further. And another limitation was that the data was self-reported by the students, which could have led to false information and skewed results. However, we would like to think the students would report accurate information. There was nothing there to prevent them from reporting whatever value they preferred. Finally, this study could be vastly improved by diversifying and increasing the size of the sample to make it more representative of the population and correct the main problem that was facing the study. It would also likely become more accurate if the data was collected in more exact ways to limit any discrepancies that may have been caused by the self-reported data. The research could also benefit from looking into better variables to predict motivational styles, such as athletic prowess, socioeconomic status, or age, amongst other possible variables. This research is very important and could have great impact on how people of different motivation styles excel in life.